Stay connected to your community and save. Just 99 cents a month gets you 3 months of unlimited access to InForum.com. Visit InForum.com/subscribe and get your first 3 months of news for only 99 cents a month.
From satirical photos of Nazis to drugs and abortion, NDSU's and Concordia's student newspapers shook up their campuses. InForum recently published a story on student journalists at MSUM rocking the boat in 1971, but equally big storms were brewing at other FM campuses. Hi, this is Tracy Briggs, and welcome to Back Then. You have to wonder how many gray hairs on the heads of university presidents in the late 1960s and early 1970s can be directly credited to the student newspaper. After all, the climate back then for young journalists was to challenge the establishment, whether it meant the campus administration or the U.S. government. Now, some saw the editors and reporters as radicals, others activists trying to stir their campuses into action. Last week, we took a look at how Morehead State College, that is now Minnesota State University, how the president there, President Roland Dill, shut down the publication of the student paper in 1971 for using 4-letter words and, quote, making mischief, end quote. But it turns out their colleagues on the other side of 8th Street in Morehead and across the river in North Fargo were also shaking things up. North Dakota State University's student publication, The Spectrum, goes back to the 19th century with the creation of the Weekly Spectrum at what was then called North Dakota Agricultural College. The top story of Volume 1 in December 1896 extolled the virtues of electricity. It read, "Within a comparatively short period of time, there has appeared in the lighting industry the electric light." Well, in less than 100 years, student journalists would move from the dawn of the light bulb to shining light and what they thought was the darkness of modern society. Now, it wasn't completely smooth sailing for the Spectrum staff before the turbulent 1960s. Case in point, in 1949, an obviously ahead of his time Spectrum editor named Daniel Chapman was reprimanded by the university for writing an editorial raising concerns that Hell Week, or fraternity hazing, was responsible for injuries suffered by a male student. The school's board of publications, though, told Chapman that, quote, it wasn't in the best interest of the school to have the editorial printed, end quote. Well, don't worry too much about Chapman, the editor. He did pretty well for himself. He actually became an attorney, a very successful attorney, working in civil litigation. Now, by the late 1960s, controversies like the one Chapman was involved in became a lot more common. In March of 1967, the editors of the Spectrum were censored by the school's board of publications after running a photo of a Nazi concentration camp in an effort to satirize how the student journalists felt they were being treated. Editor Joe Satrom in the paper had been in hot water for months as a result of some critical articles that they were writing and publishing about affairs that were both on and off campus. And that's why they decided to run this photo. Now, because this is a podcast, you can't see it, but it is basically some prisoners lined up, and then there's some Nazi officers addressing one of the prisoners. So the caption implied that Satrom was the prisoner, and the paper's advisor and NDSU's president were the Nazi officers. Now, the Spectrum said the photo was an attempt at humor, but the school was not laughing. They said it was in extremely poor taste and personally insulting to the president. The editor, Joe Satrom, resigned. Similar dust-ups happened over the next couple of years in which the editors accused administrators of trying to indirectly control the content of the paper to promote NDSU in a more positive light. In October of 1971, Spectrum managing editor Brian Tiley countered with, "I don't see why a student newspaper has to be a great respecter of sacred cows," and that the selection of editors should not be made on the basis of which candidate has, quote, antagonized fewer people, end quote. But over the next couple of years, things did start to quiet down at NDSU. So let's take a closer look now at what was going on at Concordia College. Their newspaper, the Concordian, began publishing in 1920. Headlines and stories in the early years reflected the school's Norwegian Lutheran tradition. So here are a couple headlines. From 1920, the Ladies' Aid Society of Trinity Church voted to give $150 to the fund for the redecoration of rooms in the Ladies' Hall. And this one from 1923, and I hope I can pronounce these. Olga Ingen wins first prize in Sigvald Kvali's declamatory contest. Miss Torvik takes second prize. I apologize to any Norwegians for my terrible pronunciation. But such genteel news like these stories from the 20s gave way to newspaper content in the 60s and 70s that probably made President Joseph Knudsen want to faceplant into his Roma Grote. The most notable scuffle happened in December of 1970 when Knudsen suspended the Concordian and fired the editor Omar Olson because the paper carried a paid advertisement for an abortion clinic in New York, where abortion had been legalized. Knudsen said he shut down the paper on the advice of the school's attorney, who said he believed the ad was illegal and would open up the school to legal action. Again, abortion was not yet legal in Minnesota. However, Olson, the editor, said he had no concerns about the ad because it was already being widely run in papers all across the Midwest, including NDSU, UND, the University of Minnesota, and another Lutheran school, St. Olaf, in Northfield, Minnesota. But it wasn't just that ad for the abortion clinic that raised Knudsen's ire. He also objected to other news in the Concordian that he said, quote, put in such perspective as to make drugs and sex seem to be the dominant thing among Concordia students. So a lock was put on the door of the Concordian's offices, while several hundred students and some faculty rallied in the Normandy lunchroom in support of the paper. Student Senate President Steve Tweed later told the Forum he regretted that there wasn't a massive campus demonstration over the closing of the paper. He said Knudsen and other top administrators were basically out of touch. This is his quote. There's been an effort by a few people to bring us back to the good old days where everyone stands for the same things and all disagreement is swept under the rug, end quote. Knudsen told the Forum shutting down the paper came, quote, after much expectant waiting, prayer, and deliberation, end quote. Reporters asked Tweed, again the Student Senate president, whether freedom of the press had been destroyed at Concordia, and this is what he said. There never has been freedom of the press here. We have always had editors who are willing to take orders from the president. But, he said, the difference was Olson wouldn't compromise and insisted on exercising his rights under the First Amendment, something Tweed said President Knudsen obviously can't relate to. In the next 3 months, the parties involved ironed out their differences and, with the help of the Student Affairs Committee, set up new guidelines balancing the students' freedom of speech with preventing possible legal issues for the school. So the Concordian was up and running again in March of 1971. By 1974, campus newspaper controversies all over the U.S. had cooled. Not so much because the students had changed, but because the issues had. The Vietnam War was nearly over. President Nixon and other establishment types were in trouble, and with the Roe v. Wade decision, the Supreme Court had given women nationwide the right to have an abortion. As Forum reporter Cheryl Ellis wrote in a story on February 3, 1974, the shouting on the big issues has died down for the campus press. Some loud words are heard now and again, but basically the tone is conversational, calm, and cool. Thanks for listening to this week's Back Then with Tracy Briggs. I hope you'll join us again next week.
Get reliable and accurate local news with InForum.com. InForum.com is your trusted local news source with journalists dedicated to keeping you informed about what's happening in your community. Visit InForum.com now.